Today at shopdap.com, we're going to be talking about how to inspect an Audi TT. Okay, so today we're going to be doing a vehicle inspection on this Mark 1 Audi TT 225. There are a couple different variations of these cars. They had a VR6 in these. They're not particularly common. And then there was a 180 horsepower, and this, again, is a 225, which had KO4 and then dual intercoolers. I actually personally had one of these somewhere probably around 10 or 12 years ago. So we're going to do an inspection on this car. This car does have fairly low mileage for its age, but it's right around 120-ish in mileage. So let's get into our inspection. Okay, so the major exterior stuff we're going to take a look at. I usually don't go over too much exterior stuff, but something that is repairable. This right here, you can see the headlight. It is pretty messed up. It's got some finish issues. This is what happens when they have clear coat issues over time. Most headlights do have this eventually, and this car is the same. So there's actually a process. I actually shot a video a long time ago. It's probably somewhere around 4 years ago on a Mark IV, showing the process using a 3M headlight kit. We'll link to that video where you can check it out. But essentially what you're doing is sanding down the plastic finish of this and using kind of a higher and higher grit until you get this thing kind of into a mirror finish. They also do have clear coats that go over top of these to prevent that from happening in the future. So this, while it does look horrible, it's fixable, and if you do a headlight restore on a car, it looks a million times better. It will be night and day difference once you do a headlight restore on a car like this. This paint, obviously, you can see it's cracked here. There is a little bit of rust that you can see behind there. First of all, I definitely would recommend to get this fixed, especially if you're in an area where it's prone to rust in the first place, because what will happen is you'll get more and more rust, and it'll start to eat away, and then it'll spread, and then you'll have rust damage covering this entire area. So most likely, my guess would be is that this car somehow had paint work done in this area, and that's why it's cracking here. Usually, from my experience, you don't see too much like this from factory paint. Possible, but I would suspect that there's probably paint work done at some point on this vehicle in this general area, whether it was hitting the quarter or whatever. So that could be where this is from, and the only way to fix that would be to go to a body shop and get that sanded down, brought down to metal, and then get that sprayed properly. Okay, now we're going to get this vehicle up in the air, do a suspension complete under vehicle inspection. So let's go do that now. Okay, so first we're going to take a look at the brakes and the suspension just visually from this side. So one thing that I like to do whenever I'm looking at one of these cars is always kind of rock side to side. This will tell you if you have tie rod play, and if you do feel play, which I don't, you would have to look on the inside here on the tie rod to see if you have play coming from the inner or outer joint and there. And then you can go up and down, which it's good there too. So this would tell you wheel bearing if you have wheel bearing issues. This car actually had a wheel bearing a few months ago. This is Nathan's car, our video guy, and before, I guess right after Wookiees in the Woods, he had a wheel bearing problem and we replaced it at the shop. So nothing issues in terms of wheel bearing play there, but it is something that you do want to keep an eye on there. So we're going to take a look now at the brakes so we can get a closer look here. Okay, so here you can see right back here is going to be your brake pad. That is the outside brake pad. It does have a decent amount of life left on it, but I would suspect these actually even could be original brakes. I've heard of front pads lasting a really long time. Could be, could not, tough to say. But you can see here that this vehicle has had painted calipers at least once, maybe twice. It could be red and then silver, or I don't know what's going on with this situation here. So you can see that this has been painted, and the previous owner must have been doing a little bit of customization. Okay, so here you can look at your spring and strut here, and you can check for leaks. So usually the major thing you're looking for with struts is leaking. So if you see a lot of oil around here, this means that you have a leak. And then the other thing, this is really common on Mark IV Platinum Form cars, which is the TT, is strut mounts. So right here you can see that it's moving quite a bit. And this will happen when you unload the suspension on cars that have kind of loose strut bushing. So this was super common. It always has been. If you ever have suspension noise coming from really most Volkswagen and Audi cars, but specifically ones that have strut mounts, upper bushings and bearings like this, which is pretty much all A chassis cars, you are going to want to look at the bushings and the bearings that are up here. So you can actually see this, what will happen when you lift this car up in the air, you'll see the whole wheel and tire kind of pop down as you're lifting up off the ground and as it gets out. So that's kind of a telltale sign. And you also can take a look, which we'll show you once the vehicle is back on the ground, that the strut caps kind of have a gap when you have worn strut bushings as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at our rear brakes. It does look like these pads actually have quite a bit of material as well. And always remember, the inner pad wears faster than the outer pad. So you will want to make sure that when you look at the outer pad, recognize that the inner pad is going to have less because that's where the piston pushes from on a single piston caliper, and it's going to slide kind of together. This rear caliper also does have some of that sweet custom red paint that's kind of left over. And so we can continue on to our other stuff. So once we're underneath the vehicle, I like to start with doing some suspension checks first. So start with one side, go to the other, and you kind of work your way around. So let's take a look at our passenger side wheel area, and then we'll show you a few things there. All right, so here we are on our suspension. You can check your boots, make sure you have no CV grease coming out. You can check your ball joint, make sure that the boot is not dry rotted and cracked. We already know we don't have play in the ball joint because, again, we checked that when we were doing our kind of top and bottom pulling. And if you hear that, the coolant after run pump is running, which is normal, and they will get loud as they go bad. So on this vehicle, the coolant after run pump is actually on the passenger side front near the radiator, and so that thing is running, and they get louder as they get worse. So, and we can take a look at our caliper. It looks like everything's okay there. Just make sure you got no leaks. I wouldn't expect to generally find any. And then you can, pinch bolt here, no big deal. Everything looks good. And then we're going to go around to the back side where the tie rod is. Okay, so as we look on the back side here, here's your tie rod end. And as you can see, this boot is cracked. So this thing is split right now. As we tested the side-to-side motion on this wheel, it didn't have any play, but you can be sure that eventually this thing will eventually start to have play. And again, this does control your steering of your car. So if this thing gets enough play, eventually it could break, and you'd have a hard time steering with a broken tie rod. So you will want to make sure you address that at some point. These type of things are not terribly urgent, but you will want to make sure that you address it before it becomes a problem. So now we're going to take a look at these control arms. You have a bushing here and a bushing here. These bushings can wear over time and can end up at play. So you can take a pry bar or screwdriver or something like that, and you can kind of stick it in there and kind of give it a little bit of a wiggle and see how much play, movement you have in your bushing. Now this one's got very little, so I can tell you that this thing does not have any major issues. And this is actually the same process we were doing on our Mark IV GTI when we showed you how not to buy a Mark IV GTI, where the strut fell off the steering knuckle, or the steering knuckle fell off the strut and scared the ever-living shit out of me. This one's all good, and we can continue on with our inspection. Okay, so as we look under an engine, you're going to kind of need to look around and determine if you have anything that's out of place. Now, most notably on this engine, I don't see too much out of place, with the exception of the fact that if you take a look here, you see this griminess here? This griminess is not normal. I know a lot of people think that engines are supposed to be dirty. This is a result of a leak of some kind. So most likely, because it's a 1.8T, that you have an oil leak. Most likely it's going to be valve cover and the cam chain tensioner seal. We'll take a look at that once we get up top. But as you look around, you can see there's oil in a bunch of spots here. So oil, when it's not a terribly bad leak, will oftentimes kind of create this trap for dirt. And so it'll just collect all kinds of goop on top of it. And as you can see, that all of this stuff just comes off easy with wiping and kind of just smears around. So we know we have a leak of some kind. I like to get underneath first to determine where you have a leak or the general area, and then when you go up top, you can see if you can locate what is causing the leak in that general area. So the fact that it's back here in this area mostly, I would say it's almost certainly valve cover, and then the cam chain tensioner seal is going to be on this side of the engine, which we'll show you up top when we get up there. Okay, now we look in the front area here, secondary air injection pump. These do potentially go bad, usually cause check engine lights for secondary air faults. The mounts on here break, so you can look at those and just wiggle this to see if they're cracked. A lot of times they're rubber and they get split, and this thing kind of just falls off and flops around, and then when this thing runs, when you're on cold starts, it'll kind of move all over the place and make a bunch of noise. So we know that's good. These mounts are ridiculously expensive. I want to say at one point they were like 30 bucks per piece of rubber. They're rubber with a stud on either end. They do often go bad. It looks like they've probably been replaced on this car. Serpentine belt also you can check from here because the lower engine shields are off on this car already. It doesn't have them. Looks like this Serp belt's good. No cracking. I wouldn't expect that this thing's particularly old. It's probably been replaced at some point in the somewhat near future. Going on from there, you want to just take a look at your coolant hoses. Take a look at all the mountings. Looks like it's out of the clip right here, so we can just throw that in there and kind of reclip that in. Now that's back where it belongs. And this is your boost pipe that crosses over. This goes from one intercooler to the other intercooler, which if you have a 180, you don't have this because you don't have two intercoolers. So there's one on either side that runs here and then here. And you know, people at one point were doing retrofits to have two intercoolers on the cars, and they would often do it if you swapped to a KO4 on 180s back in the day. Oil filter here, you can check to make sure you have no leaks or anything there, which I wouldn't suspect. And everything looks good here, so we can continue on. So we are going to look at our rear suspension. We're on our driver's side now. Again, everything that we're showing you, we're only showing you one side because there's no reason to check every single side unless there's something notable to look at. If there's nothing wrong, we're not showing you both sides. So same deal, kind of check the suspension, make sure you don't have any play there, and we have no play in our suspension stuff there. And you want to take a look here. At first I thought this actually looked like it may have been leaking because it was kind of darker than the rest, but it may just be cleaned for whatever reason from whatever road debris hitting it or whatever. It does not appear to be actual oil on there. You can check things like this sway bar link here, make sure that you don't have any play there. Looks okay. You can kind of wiggle it around, make sure there's no issues there. Axle boots, check them. This right here is actually your headlight leveling sensor. This actually determines for your xenons. This actually controls kind of the up and down movement of those. So this is something on these cars is metal. On the old cars, and really Mark 7s are probably pretty common because they're plastic. If you release your lower control arm here and allow the spring to kind of drop down and the shock assembly and everything, release it, it will break this arm. So that's something that we didn't touch on in our DIY for Mark 7s because our Mark 7 didn't have xenon headlights. So everything looks good here, nothing particularly concerning or anything like that. Again, checking all your bushings and stuff like that. Now we're going to move on to our diff. Okay, here we are looking at a rear differential. Here is the drive shaft, and then here's a coupler here between the front, obviously front and rear, and you have the Haldex unit, which is in here in the front, and this is what controls engaging and disengaging of rear-wheel drive. If you're not familiar with how Haldex works, we have a video that we will link to in the description to explain that. You would service it. There's a drain plug here. There's another plug there. We will at some point have a DIY going over this whole process. So really the only thing you're looking for here is two things. One, make sure you have no leaks. And then two, make sure that the bushings that control this are not worn or anything like that. So there is a rear subframe, so we'll show you just checking those real quick. Okay, so all we're doing is kind of wiggling it like that. We're sticking this between the subframe, and you can see it moves, which is normal, but it doesn't flop around. So that's really what you're checking for with bushings is they should move, they're intended to move, but if you get a lot of play in there, and this is, you'll usually see cracking inside the rubber, that's the best way to determine that you have a problem. And we're all good here, and we can continue up top. Okay, so here we are under the hood of the vehicle. Now, what you'll first notice if you've ever seen a 1.8 TT, normally you'll have a lot of engine plastic. There's going to be plastic over here that kind of runs around here. bolts into here, these guys right here, and then you'd have your air box, and then you'd have an engine cover here, and then there would be a trim right here. So all that stuff's missing, and it's really unnecessary. It's only just for aesthetics. So it does expose obviously what you have going on here. You can take a look. Now these battery panels, on a lot of Mark IVs, these were a problem where these fuses would burn out. I actually don't know how common this was on TTs. It looks almost identical to the other one, so I suspect it may have been a problem on these, but you can see because they're usually white and burnt on those covers. So we're going to look through the engine bay and go through it with a little bit tighter angle. But first, we're going to take a look here. If you see the intake, this is an aftermarket intake. You see it kind of has like this mounting bracket that sits on the trans, and then this thing kind of just lays inside of here. So if you take a look at this filter, it's kind of flat up top. Now the reason why it's flat is because it's been rubbing the hood right here. Now you can see the paint is rubbing off here. And that obviously, if you were in an area where you have a lot of corrosion, we are not, but if you were, that may be a concern in the future for where anytime you get bare metal that it could rust and then become a problem. So that's probably not going to be an issue here, but depending on the area and the vehicle, if you have an aluminum hood, obviously you don't need to worry, but if you were to have steel hood, that would be a concern. So let's just take a look here. You actually could remedy this situation. Since this doesn't actually bolt in, it kind of just lays in there, which is kind of an interesting setup. You actually could shorten this rod a little bit to solve that problem. So all it does is have a little rod in here. You even could probably bend it, or again, just shorten it and readjust this particular thing. So it wouldn't really take much to resolve that rubbing, but to get this thing down maybe an inch or so, which should get you exactly what you need. And then we can take it a little bit closer in here. So as we look closer, you can see there's a ton of vacuum routing stuff here. 1.8Ts in general, not even specific to the Audi TT, are infamous for vacuum leaks because they have a ton of vacuum lines. As these vehicles age, these vacuum lines become brittle and they're not particularly pliable anymore, and they'll eventually just kind of chafe and then crack, and then you'll end up with a vacuum leak. And usually what you'll end up doing is when you go to fix one, something will crack or break because there's hard plastic stuff in here too. That stuff gets brittle, and you end up starting with one vacuum leak, and you create more and more until you've replaced most of the vacuum lines. There are some deletes out there. It's not something that we've messed with much. And you can take a look here. This is your Pcv valve. This is your, right on the valve cover here is Pcv hose. You can kind of squeeze these, and I wouldn't do it too hard because these things, as they age, get pretty mushy. And sometimes if you push your finger too hard into it, you might just put your finger right through the hose. So these things are usually not particularly cheap. So you want to avoid damaging these if you possibly can. And again, these are another one that, because they have these rubber ones and some hard pipes and some other stuff in here, once you start taking this stuff apart, a lot of it will break, and you'll end up replacing more than you originally intended on. Now, a couple of things we want to look at. We'll get a little closer in here. Okay, so as we look a little bit closer in here, you can see this is your diverter valve. This is what controls your recirculation from your boost pipe here over to here, and this is something that if you have a boost leak, this is the first place you would always look on a 1.8T. Easiest thing to do is to take this line off, put a vacuum pump on there, make sure that the valve holds. Another funny thing about these valves on 1.8Ts, not only were they common to go bad, TTs actually had a revision early on that was kind of a upgraded or more stout version, which a lot of 1.8T people use on their cars. So they called it the 710D valve because that was a revision of, it was I believe 06A 145 710D. This valve would have been the one that you would want in your car if you wanted to kind of keep a factory DV in your vehicle, but still be able to hold a little more boost on an upgraded car. So they also can throw secondary air faults if you had a bad valve. So that's not particularly common, but it can happen from time to time. Next thing we're going to do is look at this check valve right here. Okay, so this check valve right here, these check valves are found in a bunch of 1.8Ts. A lot of times what you'll find with these is they're in the evap system. It seems to me like the fuel vapors, because of whatever the plastic material is over time, the fuel vapor will eat away at this thing and it'll just become almost nothing left of it, and they eventually leak. And almost it seems like the gray part on this side will eat away and then it'll split apart or whatever. That's also a common place that you would find vacuum leaks on these cars. Okay, so the other thing, because we had that oil leak underneath, let's take a look here. This is where the valve cover meets the cylinder head. You can take a look. There's your gasket there. If you look around, this is pretty dry all the way across. So we are going to be good with the valve cover gasket, but it does also wrap around that side of the engine, which is where the chain tensioner seal is. That's very common to leak on these. So let's take a look there. Now we take a look here. This is the driver's side of the cylinder head. You can see that this is a pretty fresh oil leak here, and that is coming from a chain tensioner seal. So that is what most likely is the result of what you're dealing with underneath the engine, and that would be what I would suggest that we're going to need to replace to address this oil leak. So I actually was talking about a chain tensioner. So it looks like this car, I didn't realize, does not have an actual chain tensioner, which just means it doesn't have variable valve timing. So it's still, I believe it still uses the exact same gasket and seal. It's like a half moon, but it just doesn't have the electronic adjuster that actually controls the variable valve timing between the cams, which means this car would not have variable valve timing, and it's just manual. So I actually did not suspect that on this vehicle. Okay, so you can see the valve cover here, your ignition coils. These are the type of coils that are not common to go bad on 180s because they're the bolt-in style. The push-in style ones are the ones that are common to go bad. I can tell you these have been replaced because they say Baru on them, and they do not have a genuine part number on there. So these are actually new coils. So at some point, this car probably had a misfire and these were replaced. Otherwise, you'd probably see a logo on them somewhere. All right, so we also, important thing on 180s, you want to inspect your timing belt. So there's your timing belt cover right here, right on top, and you can kind of pull this back and take a look at your timing belt down there. Okay, so you can see the timing belt. You usually don't have a ton of visual wear too much on a timing belt. Usually what you're more likely to be able to tell if it has been replaced, more so than it hasn't been replaced. Because obviously you'll see letters and things like that on a new timing belt, and an older one, you're not going to see much of anything. You'll see wear. If it's destroyed, obviously you know you got a problem, but 180s were really common to have issues with timing belts as far as popping if you didn't replace them. So we always used to recommend about 60 or 70,000 miles replacing your timing belt on a 180. So here's the upper part of where these strut mounts are. As you can see here, I can kind of stick my finger in between this hat when the vehicle's on the ground and the actual body of the vehicle. On a new strut mount, this is going to be real tight together. You definitely are going to you're not going to be able to get your finger. You might not be able to fit much of anything in there because this will be real tight. So that's going to be your main difference. This is an easy way to pop the hood of any Mark IV model, which is, you know, Audi TT, Beetle, GTI, Jetta, any of those cars would have this same exact setup. Obviously, it's going to look different. You're not going to have a strut brace on it like you would on a TT, but they're going to have that same gapping there. Okay, so now we are in the car. We actually have our OBDeleven scan tool, which is, if you're not familiar with Volkswagen Audi scan tool, it's plugged in the car. We are looking at the engine faults, which we can look at now. Okay, so here we can see the faults. Secondary air, incorrect. Flow detected. Bank 1, mixture adaptation. System 2, lean. And then ECM, control module disabled. And a O2 sensor, heater circuit, bank 1, sensor 1. So most likely what we have going on here is a bad oxygen sensor. This is probably a vacuum leak, although I'd wait to, if you're going to replacing the oxygen sensor, to do so. And then secondary air, as we mentioned, could be related to a bad diverter valve, which we can test, or it also could be related to a vacuum leak or something else wrong with your secondary air system. So there's a bunch of different variables there. This ECM disabled is kind of concerning. This actually potentially points to a bad ECM on this car, and I know this is a sporadic problem that causes this car to sporadically stall when this engine light pops. So it's very possible that we either have a problem with the power supply related to the ECM or the ECM itself. So one or the other is likely true, And that's what we got with this car. So you are going to always want to make sure you scan your car and make sure you know the faults that are in there before you proceed. Okay, so now we've taken a look at our faults. You can always scan your system. We just do a quick visual inspection of the interior. Not really going to talk about cosmetic stuff because I don't really think they're kind of obvious. But something I wanted to talk about is the LCD displays on early 2000 mile Audis, TT, really all of them. They're super common to get pixelated and start to disappear. This one's no different. Harry Houdini, all the text disappears. Abracadabra, you can't see anything. So this is pretty normal. I would expect as it gets hot, it actually gets worse. And so it's pretty standard. You're not going to find too many early 2000 Audis that don't have that problem. And let's talk about one other issue. One other issue is this vehicle, the turn signals do not work. No left, no right turn signal. So if you listen when I click this, you can hear inside the dash there's a relay clicking. Now what that is the hazard relay, because the turn signals on all the Mark IV model cars, really Mark IV and B5 cars, all ran through the hazard switch. So this is not the hazard switch for this car, it's for another car. But basically you have this button, and then inside you can see there's way more pins on this than it would be for just to turn hazards on and off, because the turn signals actually go through this. So what is common on this car is going to be the hazard switch has gone bad. So you will need to replace that. I think you actually can do it by taking the radio out and then pop it through the dash and then pull it through the back side of where the radio is. But you'd have to replace the hazard switch to get these turn signals working properly. So usually what will happen is they'll start to mess up over time and like sporadically like hiccup. And then eventually it'll get worse and worse until they stop working altogether. This car, coincidentally, the hazards actually work, but oftentimes when the hazard switch starts to go bad, the hazards mess up too, which they're not doing now, but it is pretty clear the left and the right side do not work at all. So it's very likely that this is going to be related to your hazard switch. Okay, we've now inspected our Audi TT. As you can see, this car has a handful of things wrong with it. To me, nothing particularly surprising for a car of this age. I actually think this car is in pretty decent shape. And while it does have some things that need to be addressed, certainly things like the ECM are probably going to be on the more expensive side. And really on most Audis, you're going to find expensive parts. You might go used on some of these things, ECM being probably one of the most notable ones. But this car is actually in perfectly driving condition, so there's nothing really major concerns that need to be addressed immediately, except for the turn signals, because those are kind of important. And we're all set. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.